Every culture has a myth about sky gods, or gods that lived in the heavens. But what if those heavens were a little closer to Earth? Today on the Musings of Rin, I will be talking about sky gods. Now, I apologize in advance if I mangle any terminology or ancient mythological names. My intention is to educate, not offend. So if this happens, please correct me in the comments. I'll start with a myth from the Efik people of southeast Nigeria. Here it is said that the sun and water lived together on Earth. Sun would visit water at his home in the seas, so he decided to invite water to his house. When water arrived, all of the sea creatures caused it to overflow. This forced the sun and his wife the moon to flee to go live in the sky where they remained. Now this is an example of a flood myth, one of many in ancient history that implies the only place to live during great floods would be in the sky. This married couple were called Sun and Moon. Does this imply humans went to live in the skies during a flood? Were they above the world on the moon perhaps? Now if we look at the structure of the moon today, it looks like a supervolcano destroyed what environment might have been up there. Was there ever a time when paradise might have existed there? Norse mythology believes the Great Flood was caused by defeating an enormous monster called Ymir. The world flooded not with water, but with the blood and bodily fluids and pieces of this creature. A single frost giant and his wife made a boat and were saved to repopulate the earth. This is another common pattern in world mythology, the idea of a boat or ark in the time of floods. In Ojibwe tribes of North America, they say the Great Spirit was unhappy with mankind and created a flood. A survivor made a raft of logs and sticks for himself and other animals. They floated for a month, but the waters did not recede. So the animals took turns trying to bring mud up from beneath the water. A coon, which is a small duck, was successful in bringing up a small piece of mud, even though the other animals thought he was too small to do it. The survivor shaped it into land, and a snapping turtle offered its back to support it. This became the earth. In Christian religion, when God became angry, he instructed his faithful servant on how to make a boat large enough to save his family and 2 of each animal. The floods came and killed everyone else. After the flood, they landed on a mountaintop above the sea. In Babylonian flood myths, Enki speaks through a reed wall to warn a hero of Enlil's plan to destroy mankind by flooding the world. The hero is instructed on how to dismantle his house and build a boat, and how to seal the sides with bitumen. In Hindu religion, Manu was not visited by a god, but rather a fish, thought to be Lord Vishnu. It told Manu that the world would be destroyed in a flood, and instructed him on how to build a boat. The fish god towed the boat to the top of a mountain. When the waters receded, he poured butter and sour milk into the sea, and a woman rose out of the waves to become his wife. They repopulated the earth. So, what caused the Great Flood? Many cultures claim the gods were punishing them. The Norse blamed a monster that fell onto the earth. Some folks claim that the Ice Age was caused by a large falling meteor, and that the dust that followed caused the freezing of the earth. The Norse survivors were called frost giants. Perhaps these stories come from the descendants of survivors at that time. In Phrygian myth, King Nanicus predicted a flood and organized public prayers to avoid it. He lived 300 years, and shortly after he died, the floods came. When it was over, Prometheus, on orders of Zeus, created images of the people who lived there before. This is believed to be linked with the Bronze Age volcanic eruption on the island of Santorini. It did not cause full world flooding, but it did destroy the island and cause tsunamis. In Buddhist religion, 1,000 dishonest carpenters were despised for being con men. They were expelled from their home, built a ship, and landed on an island that was home to a man. He told them that food was plentiful here, and they were welcome to stay, but they would be haunted by spirits. The rule for living there was to clean up after themselves. The carpenters partied, became drunk, and ignored the rules. The spirits were furious and decided to flood the island. Apparently they had been warned earlier of a flood, which they had ignored. Now one spirit told them, "Just kidding, stay here, there's no flood." A foolish and a wise carpenter argued. The wise carpenter decided to build another boat. When the floods came, only his friends and family survived. Okay, so where did the second boat come from, and how did they put it together during the hour of partying? In this myth, only one island was destroyed, not the whole world. It sounds like these people failed their test of worthiness, but saved themselves anyway by screwing each other over and stealing the first boat they already had. Not sure I like this myth very much. Many of these stories talk about being granted survival for respecting and serving the gods, or being considered worthy for good behavior. Some folks survived it on their own by being clever and taking to the seas. Other cultures were warned and instructed on how to make boats with the help of a wiser spirit. It appears as if the test of worthiness for survival was given to many peoples, but many did not make the cut. The ones that did survive repopulated the earth. One tribe ended up in the skies, several ended up on a mountain, some created their own land by bringing it up from underneath the sea, perhaps through use of a volcano. In Chinese mythology, a brother and sister were the only survivors of the great floods. They were named Pan and Gu. They floated in a gourd over the waters. Eventually they bore a wet stone mound of flesh, which was cut up and divided and became more people. Perhaps this was an abstraction to understand repopulation without providing the mechanics. It seems the gods wanted to hide from the human population the idea of sex and reproduction, perhaps to keep these children from overbreeding and exhausting the community resources. In another version, Pangu was born from an egg. Out popped a hairy giant with horns on his head. He separated yin from yang by swinging his axe, creating the earth and the sky. Pangu stood between them, pushing up the sky. It said that Pangu's bones changed to rocks, his flesh to earth, his marrow, teeth, and nails to metals, his hair to herbs and trees, his veins to rivers, his breath to wind, and his four limbs became the pillars marking the four corners of the world. This sounds a lot like the Norse myth of Ymir, where, once defeated, the monster's parts fell into the seas. Those parts became the land we live on and the resources that we see on it. The hairy giant man with horns could have been a description of the Norseman, splitting the yin and yang, or the frost giants that defeated Ymir. In Norse mythology, Asker and Embla, which means ash and elm tree, were the first man and woman. They were created from tree trunks found upon the shore by three brothers. These were gods, Odin, Vili, and Ve. It implies that the children were found near death. Odin gave them breath, Vili gave them spirit, and Ve gave them blood, which brought them back to life. In a more literal translation, perhaps they were from a shipwreck that washed up on shore, that the twins were not breathing, and to try and resuscitate them, Odin gave them a form of CPR, Vili prayed for them, and Ve gave them a blood transfusion, which brought them back to life. This story implies that creating life was not easy, and that the ancestors had to fight for it. It also implies they might have had some medical technologies back in the day. In the Yoruba mythology of creation, Oludumare is a supreme god who lives in the lower heavens. This looks out on vast stretches of ocean. He collects items to create the earth with. In the Congo version of the myth, God creates the first human being with the help of the moon. The child was named Batsi, and its body was made of clay. The child was allowed to have many children, but only needed to follow one rule. You may eat from any tree except the tahu tree. When a pregnant woman had an urge to eat the fruit, she talked her husband into getting it for her. The moon saw him, told God, and they were sentenced to have death as human beings. Now this myth has some commonalities to the Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden myth. In that myth, a snake convinces Eve to partake in eating the forbidden fruit, which she shares with Adam. In this version, their punishment is exile from the Garden of Eden. It sounds as if perhaps sun and moon from the previous flood myth came down from the skies and had a child intending to repopulate the world. Maybe they were living in clay houses, or the child had clay-colored skin. The tahu tree was the only thing the parents didn't want the kids to play with, because it was incredibly important to them. One of the descendants broke the rules and took the fruit. In punishment, they were all cast out of their parents' household to fend for themselves in exile. To some, this would have been a death sentence. In Japan, there is the story of Taketori Monogatari. A bamboo cutter came across a shiny stalk. He cut it open to find an infant about the size of his thumb. Since he and his wife had no children, they raised the infant as their own. Now when he goes out and cuts bamboo, he starts finding gold inside it, and their family becomes wealthy. After 3 months, the daughter grows into a beautiful woman. All the wealthy and powerful men want to marry her, but she devises impossible tasks for the men. They try to trick her, and they fail in the tasks. When the Emperor of Japan came, she rejected him as well, saying she was not from his country, but they did continue to converse. She eventually tells her adopted parents she has to return to her people on the moon. She was sent to Earth as a punishment for a crime to learn about material attachment. The gold was sent to pay for her upkeep. The Emperor tried to send guards to prevent the moon people from reclaiming her, but they got blinded by a strange light. The woman left a letter and an elixir of immortality for the Emperor and wished her adopted parents goodbye. The moon people place a feathery robe on her shoulders and they all ascend to the sky. The Emperor ordered his men to take the letter and a potion to the summit of the highest mountain and burn it. He did not want to live forever without her. Perhaps the child was the pregnant woman's child, who was blamed in the womb for touching the forbidden fruit. For stealing resources, she was cast out. The girl seems to know she was sent there as a punishment to learn about resources and material attachment. Perhaps her lesson was that by living among peoples whose resources were more scarce, she could come to appreciate these things. She claimed to be from the moon. It appears as if they felt responsibility for their children. They paid upkeep in gold. Did the Moon tribe have access to a gold deposit? This story has some commonality with the Moses myth. He too was a baby found amongst reeds. In the Jewish book of Exodus, the Pharaoh ordered Hebrew boys to be thrown into the Nile to keep the girls. Moses' mother hid him for 3 months, then placed him in a basket amongst the reeds. The Pharaoh's daughter found and adopted him. After killing an Egyptian slave master, Moses fled across the Red Sea, where he encountered an angel of the Lord speaking to him from a burning bush on God's mountain. Now both children were found amongst the reeds. Both were hidden for 3 months. Both were adopted by the people finding them. There was a payment of upkeep for both children. Both stories had a winged representative of the heavens. Both stories described something burning on a mountain and conversing with gods there. In the Jewish myth, the wealthy pharaoh was tricked into paying for the poor child. It seems to twist the idea of financial responsibility from oneself and the family to support its own children onto that of the community leader to support the community's children. This is a dangerous practice because a community member could start making assumptions on resources they can't see and overextend the community by having too many children, whereas families know what their own resources are and plan accordingly. Now, Jewish culture has a lot of myths and traditions around population controls, such as threatening wannabe parents with the demon Lilith coming for their children if they were not wearing medallions, purchased as a type of license. They required coming-of-age ceremonies that required special tools and administered by priests. Their priests were obviously trying to strictly regulate births. Metal tools and metal tokens are part of the rituals, which implies people pay for these things, or at least prove their wealth to be allowed to have children. If you didn't know what a circumcision ceremony was, they could have just as easily castrated you to prevent you from reproducing. It appears as if, at least in this culture, overpopulation and resource starvation was a serious problem at the time, and they blamed the poorer folks who were dumping children onto the community who did not want them. Compared to earlier creation myths, where reproduction was abstracted, in Egypt it looks like everyone figured out about sex and how to have children. There were too many children. They realized they had an overpopulation problem and were trying to convince the people to help them with failing results. Like our previous creation myths, poor mothers might have been considered as stealing resources from the rest of the community who could not support the population. The pharaohs did not need or want more slaves. It's interesting that the girls were considered sacred and protected, though. If someone from the community chose to adopt a male child floating down the river, the child would be allowed to live. If they died of exposure or were eaten by animals, then this is nature's way of telling them these children were not desired and would not survive. Their lives would be returned to nature. Now, in the Moses myth, God punished both sides. The Egyptian pharaohs and their cities were hit with plagues, but the Jewish were expelled from their homes for stealing resources. Okay, so what about the mountain with the burning bush, the meeting place of the gods? In Norse mythology, there's a place called Valhalla in the heavens. It's said to have trees of red and gold in front of it. These colors might be symbolic of burning. It was likely that this was the rowan tree. In Celtic traditions, it is considered bad luck to cut one down, and you could only harvest from it for rituals. Perhaps this was the forbidden fruit from the early creation myths. Now, the berries are considered toxic when eaten raw. It can be used for making medications for anything from joint and muscle pain to laxatives, cold medications, and to reduce inflammation. It also contains antioxidants, which are said to help control premature aging and maintain skin elasticity. You can also use it to make wine. So, it being a forbidden fruit and a protected resource makes sense. The Japanese and Jewish myths place this on top of a mountain. The takeaway from these stories is our moon or heaven tribe appears to know that resources are limited, and that there is a cost that comes with every child. It appears as if our gods were enforcing the rules surrounding population and resource controls, as humans were created and spreading throughout the world. Okay, so what else do we know about moon gods and their beliefs? Well, there's an Asian myth of the moon man and the rabbit. In the Buddhist Shakata tales, a monkey, otter, jackal, and rabbit are practicing charity on the day of the full moon. An old man comes and begs them for food. The monkey provides fruit, the otter fish, the jackal a lizard and a milk curd. The rabbit only knew how to gather grass, so it offered itself. It jumped onto the fire. Though he was blackened, he was not burnt. The moon man revealed himself to be a god from the heavens, decided to paint a likeness of this rabbit on the moon. In the Japanese version of this tale, it was a fox and monkey as companions instead. The rabbit's reward was passage to the moon. In the Aztec legend, the god Quetzalcoatl was living on Earth. The rabbit offered herself as food when he was hungry and saved his life. As such, he elevated her to live on the moon with him, then lowered her back down to Earth, saying she will be remembered. Their rabbit was a woman. In Cree culture, the legend tells about a rabbit who wants to ride the moon. Only the crane wanted to take him there. The trip stretched the crane's legs. When they reached the moon, the rabbit touched the crane's head with a bleeding paw, which is why its head is red. In Christian religion, the heavens are described as being the location of the throne of God, and where the angels reside. These are essentially God's enforcers. To get there, you have to ascend by having a righteous death, by doing good deeds and following God's laws. In Hindu mythology, the heavens is called Svarga. They describe it as being a place of water lilies and lotuses. You could gain access to it by being rewarded for performing sacrifices. You would first travel to the heavens, then sacrifices would be demanded to gain admission. They also agree that offering gifts to guests is one path to entry into heaven. Now, Svarga is the land where one hopes to meet one's departed ancestors. Norse Valhalla was a hall of heroes where valiant warriors would be brought by the Valkyrie warriors when they died in honor of their deeds. The Valkyrie women served wine and food, and the men told tales of their deeds. In Greek mythology, there's the story of Orion, a good-looking male hunter who was blinded for raping the king's daughter Merope or Hero. When he restored his sight, he became the hunting companion of the goddess Artemis. He died by being hit by one of her arrows, poisoned with scorpion venom. He was then elevated to a place amongst the stars by the gods. perhaps out of friendship, or for helping her on her travels, or maybe just an apology for hitting him with the arrow. Now Artemis was a huntress goddess linked to the moon. She was said to have domain over the wilds and nature, and had an entourage of women called nymphs. She had a twin brother Apollo, who was a sun god. He was said to rule over the weather and prophecy. Is this a coincidence? Was Artemis the leader of the moon tribe, or just a leader of a particular group of them? Were these our sun and moon? Perhaps Orion and Odin were the same person. The spelling is similar. Both of them had a birth myth surrounding a cow. Perhaps they were descended from shepherds or cared for animals. Odin was often depicted wearing an eye patch, perhaps temporarily blinded until he got used to seeing with one eye. Orion met Artemis, who sounds a lot like Freya. Odin's wife was said to be Frigga, which when spoken sounds like Freya. Freya seemed to preside over the heavens' lands where men could travel to for good deeds. After being poisoned and declared dead, Orion was sent to live in the stars. Odin presided in Valhalla, where Valkyries brought worthy men to the heavens for good deeds. The Valkyrie sound like the nymphs, an entourage of women. Both Odin and Orion were said to be good-looking men who slept with many women. Odin was cited as having several progeny with different women. In the myth about Svarga, it also seems to imply that a reward for being granted entry into the heavens was sex and an elevation of your status. The Valkyrie were a group of women warriors, much like the Scythian Amazons. Like men, they participated in war and hunting. In Amazonian culture, they invited male heroes into their cities temporarily to breed children. They kept the female children for their own tribe and returned the males to their fathers. They shared the men and didn't marry. This tracks with the idea that perhaps Odin and other worthy heroes were rewarded with sex and reproductive rights with this tribe of women. Of the mothers of Odin's children, we know of Frigga, possibly Freya, and Jord. Freya is said as having 2 daughters with a man named Odr, but Frigga is said to have 2 sons with Odin. If she was a Scythian woman, she would have kept the girls and gave him the boys. Jord is said to have 1 son, Thor, with Odin. It appears as if all of these myths talk about the moon as a place to which people could travel. You could gain admission to it through good deeds and by impressing an existing god, perhaps through acts of charity and sharing resources. You could find your own way there at risk of physical damage or changing oneself. You might then be asked to sacrifice or bring gifts to gain admission. If you were found worthy, they would elevate your status and perhaps offer you sex with beautiful warrior women. I suppose many men would consider that heaven. Perhaps this was the women's way of controlling reproduction rights and the population of the surrounding area. Only women were allowed to choose sex partners and decide to bring life into the world. Most cultures have this idea about death and rebirth into the afterlife. Perhaps these moon people were saving folks from a metaphorical death of exile and abandonment rather than a literal physical death. They brought the one animal that had no food to the moon. Perhaps they were attempting to scout for those they felt needed help, and decide whether to keep them or cull them. As I compare the myths surrounding the moon and early man, I'm starting to be drawn more and more to the theory and beliefs surrounding Valhalla. Now, Christian mythology and many mythologies divide the world into heaven, earth, and the underworld. But if we look at Norse mythology, which produced the Valhalla myth, they talk about a much more advanced universe. It is one divided into 9 realms connected by Yggdrasil, or a massive tree with roots. They have this conceptual map of worlds associated to elevation levels. At the top is said to be Ljosalfheim, the realm of the light fairies and elves, a very magical realm. There are also said to be other heavens, Andalgar, which was described as being south and above. A city Gimli was said to be even higher than that of Bjoblain. Only light elves were thought of as living in this place. The light elves were described as being fairer than the sun. perhaps blonde or yellow-skinned. The Elselfa sounds almost Asian, doesn't it? Below them was Asgard, Glasor, and Idavallur. Asgard was the home of the gods. Glasor was a tree growth bearing red leaves outside the doors of Valhalla, those rowan trees. Idavallur was a religious site and meeting place of the gods. They stacked stones and placed altars here, perhaps where you gave offerings or performed sacrifices. Jotunheim and Asgard are joined by a sort of bridge called Lidskelf, which in Norse mythology is a throne or high seat, with a wide view which allowed Odin to see all the realms, some sort of lookout point. Below Asgard there is another bridge connecting it to the world below, called Himmelbjorg. This is described as being Heaven's castle or Heaven's mountain. It's where the watchman Heimdall presided, watching for invaders, as well as keeping an eye open for Ragnarok. You had to cross a burning rainbow bridge in order to gain access to the heavens through him. Below Asgard was Vanaheim. It was thought to be in the underworld. In it lived a group of gods who were associated with fertility, wisdom, and prophecy. They were thought to be above Midgard, Jotunheim, Utgard, and Udain-Zakur. Udain-Zakur was the land of immortals. Some say it was perpetually spring, eternally day, with never-ending flowers. Sounds kind of like Catholic heavens. Freya's fields were perhaps here, and it's where they sent the poor but good folks when declared dead. Perhaps this is where our visiting adventurers would seek admittance to the heavens. Jotunheim was where the tribe of Jotun, or frost giants, lived. It is described as having dark forests and mountain peaks, where winter never ends. Utgard literally means outyards. It is said to be the home of external cosmic forces, so perhaps a city in Jotunheim. Midgard is thought of as being on Earth in the underworld. It is said to be the land of humans, those born after the gods who came down from the floods, perhaps. Maybe it was a city. Niflheim is below Midgard. It is said to be a mist world of primordial ice. In it is Nastrand and Hvergelmir. Hvergelmir is an underwater spring source. Helheim, where Hel presides, is said to be under Midgard, under the roots of the cosmic tree Yggdrasil. Possibly within Niflheim. Maybe it was a jail of some sort. Nastrand was said to be a corpse shore where Hel's dogs chewed on corpses guilty of murder, adultery, or oath-breaking. Implied something acidic or poisonous dripped from the ceilings onto prisoners' backs there. There is also a land or city called Nidavellir, a realm of dwarves, a race of master smiths and craftsmen who reside underground, working the mines and forges. The name literally means dark fields. Nearby is Svartalheim, where the black or dark elves are said to live. They were described as being blacker than pitch. Below them is Muspelheim, said to be a realm of fire ruled by Surtur, a Jotun giant who will bring the flames of Ragnarok. Okay, so if our heavens surrounded this tribe of women that invited worthy men, and Freya or Frigga presided over the fields, we know a little about her heritage. Freya's father was Vanir, said to be created by the wise powers there. Some say Jord might have been her mother. Jord's mother, Not, was a half Jotun and half dark elf. She was described as being black and swarthy. She had children with 3 men, true to Scythian style. Jord's father was a dwarf. If this is true, that means Freya had the blood of the Vanir, dark elves, Jotun, and dwarves. That's 4 races. Men of all races were invited into their halls, and through these women, they created a multicultural tribe. Perhaps they were aiming for genetic diversity, or to create a stronger bloodline. In Jewish Kabbalah theory, the moon is considered to be linked to one of the 10 attributes of God, or the Sephiroth. Malkuth, the 10th attribute, was considered to serve as the earthly bridge between man and the God, from which we are ruled. It was like a place or a kingdom said to lie above the world, of the Qliphoth, or the Tree of Death. Some consider it linked to the moon because it doesn't shine under its own power. Divine light from the sun, which life depends on, is reflected down on us. In the Zohar, it describes the moon as descending into the realm of Beriah, which is said to be the second of 4 celestial worlds. The first world was Atziluth, the seat of God. The moon people originated from it. Once sent to Beriah, you were ruled by Akatriel, the crown of God, and you did not go back. It was said the folks from the moon, reaching Beriah, began to belittle themselves and dim their own light. From their darkness gave birth to the Qliphoth, which brought impurity or chaos. The idea was that without being surrounded in evil, you could not train someone to be good. In the book of Genesis, it describes the moon and sun as luminaries, but spelt it as curses. Is this social commentary? Did the Hebrew peoples hate their godly parents? It almost sounds like they're trying to justify bad actions, that from evil you bear good and holiness. This is a little bit similar to the idea of Christian fallen angels. They would get cast out of the heavens for disobeying or sinning, they would be stripped of their wings, and the fallen angels presided over hell. In Norse mythology, we have the story of Hel in the underworld. Here, Hel is the daughter of Loki, the troublemaker. Loki was a half Jotun. His father was a frost giant, and his mother a slender and weak goddess. Hel was a woman of half blue, half flesh-colored skin. She was sent to rule over what was described as many mansions with servants in her underworld realm. She was a forbidden birth. Loki hid her and her brothers for months. Because she was a woman and looked more human than her brothers, they didn't punish her as harshly. In the myth of Balder, the trickster god Loki plotted his death, and the gods lost their tolerance for his behavior and imprisoned him. Balder was supposed to be impervious to harm, much like the Greek Achilles myth. But Balder's one weakness was mistletoe. He was allergic. He was struck with an arrow shaft thrown by his one-day-old blind little brother Hoder, who was tricked by Loki to aim at Balder. Now, the Norse mythological tradition was that anyone marked as dead would either go to Valhalla, Freya's workfields, or Hel's underworld. To be marked dead, you had to be elderly, dying, criminal, or poor. The decorated retiring war heroes traditionally went to Valhalla for their honor and service. Think of it as a really nice retirement home where the old guys traded stories, did a lot of drinking, and maybe got sex. The poor went to Freya's fields in Vanaheim to presumably work and help the community generate food. She was a goddess associated with hunting, fertility, and the earth. The rest of the elderly, dying, or criminals went down to Hel's underworld. The murderers, adulterers, and oath-breakers were imprisoned and punished. The remaining elderly and dying got to live with her in the city of the dead. As Balder suffered an extreme allergic reaction, they thought he was going to die. Instead of risking spreading illness on the settlement above, down he went. They carried him to his ship, which was ceremonially burned. His wife, who also died of grief, was placed on the fire with him, along with his horse. A dwarf named Leader was also sent with them. This ship would be carried down the river to Hel's underground. Much like the myths of Chiron, it was a boat ride down the river Styx. In the underworld, Balder recovered. Tradition said that once in the underworld, you were not allowed to return. But his mother Frigga was distraught and really wanted him back. She sent a man, Hermod, who rode Sleipnir, an 8-legged horse, 9 nights through deep dark valleys of the Gjoll Bridge, a river separating the living and the dead. Again, sounds like Styx. He reached the bridge, which was said to be covered in shining gold, guarded by a frost giant, Modgerd. She said Balder had already arrived, and they should ride down and north. He rode his steed over the gate. Hel claimed Balder would only be allowed to return if all things dead and alive would weep for him, meaning basically nobody wished him any kind of harm. Balder and his wife gave the death gifts back to be brought to his mother and aunt. One person, a Jotun thought to be Loki in disguise, refused to weep, and Balder remained in the underworld with Hel. This myth seems to imply that the gods from above were sending down their undesirables to Hel. They were being cast out of heaven. Those who died of no fault were rewarded with a place of honor among Hel's household. She must have maintained a hospital or a rest home, a city there. Perhaps it was Midgard that was supposed to be above Helheim. The murderers, adulterers, and oath-breakers were imprisoned and subjected to torture. The rest were either housed until their death and buried, or cast out into exile in the harsh environments to make it on their own. This sounds exactly like what was described by the Jewish Zohar. The people they were seeing coming out of Hel's underworld weren't looked highly upon because they were the worst of gods, falling into the world of sins that humans were said to inhabit. They weren't even accepted into Midgard. They weren't holy, good, or respected, and that's why they were cast out. They were there to learn from man, or suffer with them. It sounds like the surrounding tribes and peoples were rejecting these folks. They didn't want them in Midgard, they were causing problems. Some people may have wandered off into the wilderness and tried to survive on their own, or grouped up together to form new tribes around the heavens. It also implies that perhaps the Jewish Zohar was written from the perspective of peoples from Midgard, not folks who had lived above in heaven's fields, who would have been the chosen of these women. So uninitiated outsiders looking inward, trying to understand what was going on, based on what little they were being told from the gods above. Okay, so where was this Sun-Moon tribe? Can we use the mythological stories to pinpoint where in the world they might have been living? If the Valkyrie were Amazons, then Themyscira was said to be on the Black Sea. A Scythian burial was found in southwest Russia on the north banks. In it, only women were found, nomads and warriors. The eldest woman was in her late 40s or early 50s, and she wore a gold headdress decorated in floral patterns. They thought it was from 400 BC and indicated that she had Iranian descent because it looked Hittite. In the Norse mythology of Sif, she was a blonde earth goddess, possibly a light elf, and she was married to Thor, Jord and Odin's son. Loki, in mischief, cut off her hair as a prank, so was ordered to replace it with gold. He gave her a gold headdress. It was supposed to represent fields of golden wheat. The description of Freya's fields were that they were covered in flowers. It sounds a lot like the headdress found buried in Russia. Was this one of her descendants, or was it just traditional that they wore this type of headdress? What about Valhalla's trademark red and gold rowan trees? Well, this tree could be found across most of Europe, in Turkey and in Iran. In the birth myth of Artemis and Apollo, they were told they could not be born on land. They had to come to an island refuge, thought to be Delos. This is in the Aegean Sea. However, it's only 112 meters above the water, so in times of great floods, it would not have been above the surface. Perhaps it was somewhere nearby at a higher elevation. Tevzlani Hoyuk is a mound located in the center of the Tevzlani Plain, near the Oraneli River in Turkey. It's the largest mound in the region and is said to have started in the Neolithic period, but belongs mostly to the Bronze Age. Tevzlani is called the place with rabbits. The rabbit was invited to join the moon people. Is this a coincidence? What about our Helheim myth? At the port of Helheim there is said to be a bridge covered in shining gold. In Turkey there is an ancient city called Gordion, where the famous king of Phrygia, Midas, reigned. He was known for his love of gold. This city is found on the Sakarya River and was first inhabited in the early Bronze Age. There is a tumulus or burial mound here containing a complex pine wood construction. In recent years they started looking around Turkey for signs of the biblical ark. Could this wood construct be our biblical ark? Inside it there were artifacts thought to belong to Midas's father. It included some furniture where several of the designs look Viking in origin, depicting not designs you typically see in Celtic, Norse, or Middle Eastern cultures. Okay, so if this was Helheim, where was Valhalla? In Baldur's myth, they lit a boat meant to propel it on its way to the underworld. Now, did they burn the ship, or light some sort of fueled propulsion meant to start moving it downstream? Is this some sort of god rocket fuel analogy? If this is the case, this means Asgard was upstream from Helheim. If we consider Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse that was ridden 9 nights through deep dark valleys to get there, what might Sleipnir have been? There's one perfect image of an 8-legged horse on an Egyptian wall depicting a chariot. They just don't show the second body of the horse. But if you know what a chariot is, you know it's not one horse, it's actually 2. Perhaps the person describing Sleipnir didn't know what a chariot was. The chariot invention was linked to the area and Phrygians as well. Specifically, they credit it to the Hittites. This is also found in the region of Turkey. The twins Freyr and Freya are both associated with chariots. Apollo had a daily task to harness 4 horses to pull his sun chariot across the sky. Okay, so if it was a chariot, what would 9 days upstream by chariot be? In Geographica, Strabo wrote the river Sakarya was sourced on Mount Adorius, near the town of Sangia in Phrygia. Its official site is unknown. Some say this might be in the neighborhood of Pessinus, which is nearby Gordian. There is an ancient city there, and it is 950 meters above sea level. Gordian sits at 692 meters above sea level. So yes, they would have been above them. At times of great floods, perhaps Gordian was on its shores. It was believed the Celts occupied the territory between Gordian and Pessinus around 278 and 277 BCE due to remains found in the area. Perhaps the Norse were here longer than they thought. At Pessinus, there was a temple later repurposed by the Romans. Strabo claims the priests were potentates on ancient times. They thought they were cults surrounding Cybele. Pessinus's male priests were eunuchs. Was this Valhalla? Were men only allowed to stay permanently in the women's city if they castrated themselves? Was this one of the sacrifices to be in the heavens? Udain-Zakur was said to be Freya's heavenly fields. Freya was said to have a stronghold at Ben Salir, which literally means Fen Halls. There is a marshland immediately to the south of Pessinus, where the Sakarya River comes closest to Pessinus today, in a place called Yenidogan. At Sivrihisar, northwest of Pessinus, there are some wonderful natural mountains that make an excellent lookout point. There's a castle believed to be built in the time of Justinian in this region, as well as a pile of rocks sitting in the middle of the steppe. Were these rocks a former castle? This would make for an ideal location for Hindenburg. The hills surrounding Sivrihisar look like half of a crater. Was this an ancient volcano? Online, there are images of opal found in this region. It's said to have iron, opal, and chalcedony here. So could this be our burning rainbow bridge, if there was lava and opals here? Freyr was said to sit on the high sea Hlidskjalf, looking out on the worlds, and this is how he saw the Jotun woman he wanted to marry. The throne existed at a high lookout point, and it was said that when Odin sat there, he could see and hear all of the realms below. Freyr was also said to rule Alfheimr, the home of the elves. To the southwest of Pessinus, there's a place called Midas's Throne, near Yazilikaya. This was believed to be a Hittite site where they worshipped the lunar and solar movements. It sits at 1,183 meters above sea level, higher than Pessinus, where only light elves were said to dwell. Carved into the rocks, there were figures of folks with tall hats, similar to what the style was in Egypt, as well as remarkably similar to the headdress the buried Scythian, possibly Sith descendants wore. In Chamber A, there are 64 deities in procession. The left wall shows male deities, the majority of them wearing kilts, pointed shoes, and tall hats, though some of the men were bald and wore skirts instead. Celtic men wore kilts. Mongols wore pointed shoes and tall hats. Does this imply the majority of the gods were some sort of blend between these two peoples? Were Hittites, who were believed to be early Middle Easterns, half European and half Mongol? 4 of the men look like they have bald heads. Perhaps it was to imply age. Some of the men wore skirts. Does this imply castration, like the priests of Valhalla? The things they are holding probably imply their role in the heavens. The 12 men at the back of the procession hold no tools and have no beards, so they were probably children. In front of them, 5 men were depicted as seated in some sort of boat. Perhaps they were boat rowers. Many of the men had symbols above them, perhaps indicating they did odd jobs for the community. In front of them was a group of men holding weapons, probably warriors. I can see clubs, sickles, and staves, as well as bows. 2 men look like minotaurs holding up some sort of vessel, perhaps heavy laborers or berserkers. In another version of the drawing of this, they look like they could be shorter men holding up the earth. Perhaps they were the dwarves, the underground allies of the settlement. 1 man looked like a high priest of some sort, and 2 men in front of him held a horn and a flask. The right wall showed the female deities wearing square hats that looked like the Scythian headdress, and they also wore long skirts. The women pretty much looked uniformly the same. On the north wall, both processions meet. 2 men wearing kilts and tall hats are standing on a mountain. Perhaps these are Heimdall and Freyr, who presided over the 2 lookout points. The man leading the male procession is standing on 2 people, offering a flower to the woman in front of him. The 2 men he stands atop look like they're apologizing, and they are dressed in skirts like women. The woman leading the female procession is standing on top of a dog. She also offers a flower to the man. Behind her is a woman dressed as a man standing on a dog holding an axe, and directly behind her is 2 more women standing over a 2-headed bird. This is exactly how Amazons used to divide their tribe. Men and women did not live together. The women lived in Valhalla with Jord. Men were only temporarily invited up there. The men generally lived below. Frigga or Freya ruled below, so perhaps she was the one dressed as a man, and the woman leading the procession was Jord. Perhaps this carving implies Baldur's funeral procession, or peace being declared between the men and the women. It looks like it very clearly describes the roles available to men in their community, and that there was a limited number of them. Hodar was described as being a blind son of Odin, kinda like Orion. He was only there for a day and then accidentally shot Baldur. Nanna died of grief. Hodar took his place. He was replaced by Vali a day later. Then Frigga mourned Baldur and would frequently be crying looking for Odin. Eventually we had an eye-patched Odin. There's one guy that looks like an archer general, 2 people back from the lookouts. He's wearing 2 types of dress. Perhaps this was to symbolize Baldur's replacement. Further back in the army procession, the unarmed man, possibly blind Hodor, appears to be a child. Did these men keep the god myth alive by becoming a role? Was it an accident that Baldur got shot, or was Loki clever enough to figure out the flaw in their system and use Hodor to make a point? The Vanir and Aesir used to be at war, but later made peace and joined. Maybe someone from a Vanir ancestry was trying to document the history of the surrounding area. Freya and Freyr's father Njordr came from a place called Vanaheim. This is where the wise powers were said to have created him. The artwork at Midas's throne was said to be Hittite, and the Hittite capital was said to be in Hattuasas, further to the east, towards central Turkey. They believe the city was burned to the ground in 1700 BC. They claim a King Anita claimed credit and left an inscribed curse saying, "Whoever after me becomes king resettles Hattuasas, let the storm god of the sky strike him." Thor would have been the general of the Norse god's army, and he was a thunder god. If the procession is any indication, I guess their army was 10 to 16 men, give or take 12 children. Jotunheim was said to exist in dark forests and mountain peaks where winters never ended. If they were living next to a volcano, any place within the surrounding region with forests in an ice age could potentially be dark with the winter never ending. Freyr wanted to marry Gerdur, a woman from Jotunheim, and he saw her from sitting on Midas's throne. Now, he travels with his servant Skirnir through wet mountains and darkness to reach her. Unfortunately, a lot of the region would have been mountainous. In Glyphagning, they describe Jotunheim as being all around them, with the Jotun living on the shorelines. Most stories describe the settlement they travel to as being north. There are 2 settlements to the north of Midas's throne. Eskisehir, where they found pottery burials of children, as well as jewelry, and Tavslani, where they found that raised plateau, with signs of an ancient settlement. At Tavslani, they found indications of copper and silver mining, as well as a textile trade. Perhaps these were Jotun settlements. Nidavellir was said to be the underground city of the dwarves. There is a huge underground city centered around Derinkuyu that they believe could have sheltered up to 20,000 people together with livestock and food stores in the Ice Age. The underground city could be closed from the inside with large rolling stone doors. In one Norse poem, they describe the dwarves as groaning behind their stone doors during Ragnarok. The dwarves were said to live near the Dark Elves at Svartalheim. Just to the northeast of Derinkuyu sits Karahuyuk, where they found signs of a Bronze Age Assyrian trading post. It sits in a rich agricultural area of Turkey that possibly holds Black Earth, which Nidavellir was named after. It sat between Anatolia, which is Turkey, northern Syria, and Mesopotamia. The Dark Elves had pitch-black skin, so since the folks from Mesopotamia would have been closer to Africa, this makes sense that they'd have darker skin in this direction. So it looks like our sky gods, the Sun and the Moon tribe, was living in western Turkey. How widespread was this tribe's worship? In Mesopotamia, there exists another winged goddess, Inanna. She was known by the Babylonians, Assyrians, and Akkadians as Ishtar. Her husbands had many names, including Durmazud, Tammuz, and Adon, which indicates she might have been a practicing Valkyrie. Her name is suspiciously similar to Nanna, Baldur's wife, who descended from Asgard with him out of grief. Images of Inanna appeared as early as 4000 BC. She was said to descend into the underworld ruled by an older sister. Enki sends 2 castrated servants to rescue her. Her husband, Dumazud, was forced to remain. This implies that in the Midas's throne carving, Odin was the one standing on top of 2 servants who were castrated, apologizing to the women to return Nanna. In the Inanna myth, Durmazed was allowed to return to the heavens for half the year. His sister Geshitinanna came down to live with him in the other half. It sounds like these people were linked. This is very similar to the Greek myth about Hades and Persephone. Persephone would be in the heavens with her mother Demeter for 6 months of the year. In the winter, she would be in Hades with her husband. If you alternated between farming and hunting to produce food during the seasons, perhaps you had Baldur and Nanna alternating with another man and woman for half the year. If Nanna was the woman who was cast out, perhaps while she was in the underworld she traveled around and spread the religion. Inanna was considered to be a conquering goddess. She took over regions previously dominated by other gods. For some, she's considered to be both a moon and a sun god. Her main temple was in Uruk, near the Euphrates River in Iraq. The temple was believed to house priestesses and the goddess. She was loved by the gender-fluid folks. She adopted gay male priests, supported cross-dressers, and eunuchs. It was believed that men would gain the right to rule by engaging in sexual intercourse with her, by being her consort. She was associated with the lion, the owl, and the eight-pointed star. The owl and lion are symbols also linked to Greek goddess Athena. Athena had a widespread following across the Mediterranean and Turkey. Her temples existed in Athens, Argos, Delos, Delphi, Sparta, Rome, Troy, Smyrna, as well as many other places. In Egypt, there were many royal women buried in the Valley of the Queens between 1290 and 1220 BC. Unless they were children, the men were buried separately in the Valley of the Kings. This is exactly what we saw in Midas's throne, the idea of separating men and women in society. They claim in the Moses myth, around 1200 BC, at the time of Ramses II, that Moses ran to a mountain with a moon maiden temple to get help from the gods. As Pharaoh Ramses conquered part of Canaan and Phoenicia, he warred with the Hittites in Syria, and they declared peace in 1258 BC. They seem to be frequently at odds with the Hittite clan. Ramses II worshipped the sun god, Ra. When humankind plotted against Ra, he sent his eye, the goddess Sekhmet, to punish them. Sekhmet was our warrior goddess in this region. She was the cat god. Now, Ramses is known for doing a lot of rebuilding of temples and carvings. The Sphinx was said to date to 2500 BC at the time of Khafre. Many believe it used to have a cat's face, and a smaller pharaoh face was carved over it. That it was supposed to guard the pyramids. Did Khafre change his mind and decide to put himself up there instead of Sekhmet? Okay, so why is Cybele the one who presides over Pessinus and not Athena or Inanna or Sekhmet? Cybele is a Greek earth or mother goddess. She's associated with the Greek earth goddess Rhea, the wife of Cronus and mother of Zeus. Jord's son was Thor. Zeus and Thor are both thunder gods. Rhea was the daughter of a Titaness. Jord was the daughter of Nod, a Jotun or frost giant. Cybele was said to be a hermaphrodite, worshipped alongside Attis, a fertility god. She's linked to the natural world, fertility, and growth. Early depictions look a lot like Jord. An alternate name for Jord is Fiorin, which has also been linked to her father, so she's another deity linked to both a man and a woman. We know the Greeks lived in a time where they were moving away from the idea of women living alongside the men. If you were a misogynist, believing women had no place ruling or doing men's jobs, you probably pretend women had male parts to believe they were leaders of another tribe to save your pride, wouldn't you? If Jord were the reigning queen at Valhalla, and Odin was only a temporary consort, then it would make sense that the temple worshipped her and not him directly. Remember that Valhalla was about reproduction and not war. Warriors, when retired, would come to Valhalla to share their stories before mating with women to produce new children. The next generation would replace them in their god roles in the future. They were restarting the cycle, so to speak. Humankind seemed to have more respect for warriors and the production of food rather than the sacred creation of life. So below, in the underworld, you see temples to warrior women instead. These were the mouthpieces of the gods and their army. As the population grew and the climate got milder, perhaps the surrounding peoples could produce their own food more effectively and didn't need to rely on the support of these women at Valhalla. Less and less people probably came directly to that temple for their services. They were probably going to the individual outposts throughout the world. We know that today we don't live under a matriarchal rule. So what happened? In Norse mythology, Ragnarok was said to be a series of events that would lead to the death and downfall of the gods. It included a great battle which would kill Odin, Thor, Tyr, Freyr, Heimdall, and Loki. There would be natural disasters like the burning of the world in a flood. It was said that after these events the world would rise again and the survivors would meet and they would start over. It is said that brothers would fight and kill each other. Sisters' children would defy kinship. Basically, the men wanted power, and even though they were the children of the sisters, they were going to turn on them. They claimed that the inhabitants of Muspelheim, the land of fire, would come forth. Maybe this means lava flow or massive forest fires? Jotunheim was to be a roar, and the dwarves would seal their doors. Earthquakes would swallow up the Jotnar women. Loki would be released from his imprisonment in the chaos. Sol would be killed by Fenrir. Loki's sons would fight Odin and his sons, and all but Loki will perish. Then Heimdall and Loki will fight, and they will both be slain. After this, the people will flee their homes, and the sun becomes black while the earth sinks into the sea. The stars will vanish, steam will rise, and flames touch the heavens. When everything dies down, Balder and Hodor will return from Hel. Njordr will return to Vanir. Sol's daughter will take up her mantle. In another version, they claim Hel would ride a scaled ship made from the finger and toenails of the dead to lead an army of dishonorable dead to the heavens. This will destroy the gods and restart the cycle. In Christian mythology and the Book of Revelations, it talks of God's temple in the heavens being opened. There were flashes of lightning, earthquakes, thunder, and hail. A woman who was dressed in the sun with the moon at her feet, which could have been metal bracers or bracelet, and a diadem of 12 stars, some sort of crown. She was followed by a red dragon with 7 heads and 7 diadems and 10 horns. So maybe it was a red boat in the shape of a dragon with 10 oars and 7 guys on it. The dragon stopped before a woman as she gave birth. As it was a male child, it was given to God and his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness. There was a booming speech, which is a little abstract, but it essentially sounds like they're chasing down an enemy, the devil, under the authority of God. Now, if you take this at face value, it sounds like a show put on to explain that women are what gave birth to children, and that women were to bear children for men, and that there's possibly another man down here they're chasing down who spoke ill of their kind, who sided with the woman. So basically, it was decreed by him that she will proclaim no more kings, her princes were gone, her castles will be overgrown and forgotten, she would come to rest in the wilderness alone, as he has decreed, and he will send people to her. It basically implies those people will never return. They're basically killed. She was linked as being a destroyer of children, the enforcer of death among unwanted infants. In Jewish mythology, Lilith was the first wife of Adam. They claimed they were both formed of the same clay and were equals, but they fought. She was banished from the Garden of Eden for not obeying him or submitting to his rule. It basically sounds like the patriarchal gods won out over our female goddesses. No longer did they want to live as equals. Now this is actually very important. Once the secret to reproduction and childbirth got out amongst the population, no longer did the world have to depend on a female cult to produce children. Men could use their superior strength over women and didn't have to respect them or seek their consent for sex. These men might have hard feelings towards the female leaders for being lied to and denied pleasure that they could have had easily without traveling to their shrines, providing offerings, or sacrificing for it. They didn't actually have to be good people to get rewarded. They had the power to breed their own armies and workforce, and they didn't need to rely on women for anything. So now came the age of men, basically. In the Gylfaginning, a woman named Sol or Suna and her brother Mani or Moon were being chased by 2 wolves. Skoll sought Sol, and Hati chased Mani. The story claims that after Ragnarok, Sol's legacy will be carried on by her daughter. Loki's son Fenrir was said to be a wolf. Perhaps he or his descendants were the ones said to be chasing Mani and Sol. And the event they're describing is either during or in the aftermath of Ragnarok. In a poem Grimnimsal, Odin claims that Sol had a sister Sinthgund, that these 2 sisters were said to be followed by Freya and Vala. the sister that lives with and serves her. Later Greek mythology links Freya to the moon, not the sun. Perhaps they purposely changed the woman to the lesser role. The latest Saul and her brother Mani were children of a man Mundilfari. The man married his daughter to a man named Glenir, which angered the gods. In our society of women gods, the men did not have the right to choose a woman's sexual partner. This would have angered them. They took the two children away from Mundilfari and placed them in the heavens. The children were made to drive the chariot that drew the sun across the skies, kind of like the Apollo myth, except they shared the role. Hijuki and Bil appeared to come after them in succession. They were the children of Vidfinner, taken by Mani, and they were fetching water from a well. Now, if Saul was followed by Freya, does that mean the abducted children were Freya and Freyr, given new names by the heavens? And that these two children were taken from the Vanir? Vid means wood. Vanir sounds like veneer. Perhaps these were Vanir living in the woods. Njordr, their father, was said to live in Noatun, or ship enclosure, as it meant. This was described as being on heaven's lands. It was said he ruled over a high-timbered temple, and he was linked to the sea and fishing. The Norse believe wise powers sent him to be hostage to the heavens' gods. Perhaps he landed on their land. Perhaps this is the remains of Noah's Ark, and Njordr is Noah. In a tumulus under Gordian, there lies the remains of a timber structure where a man was buried surrounded by wealth. Perhaps this is Njordr's burial and the remains of Noah's Ark, or some sort of structure that was meant to symbolize it. Perhaps it's Freyr's burial, and it's meant to symbolize his origin. As Gordian was thought to be Helheim, it stands to reason there would be burials around this region for the honored dead. One story implies that Freyr landed with him, that Njordr took a new Jotun wife, Skadi, and begat a daughter, Freya, before the children were taken away. They later imply Skadi left Njordr to be with Odin in the heavens. If our reproductive cult was hiding the origins of sexual reproduction as a means to enforce population and resource control, it stands to reason that they'd absorb a woman who knows how to reproduce, and that they'd take the children sourced outside their control. Perhaps they educated Njordr in their ways and promised his children would be given a place of honor in their community in order to placate him and prevent him from having further children or wives. This seems to solidify the idea that our gods were immortal by apprenticing and training successors to carry on their legacy and work. They didn't actually live forever. If this is indeed the origin of the flood myths, then it makes sense the Norse gods would test other peoples invited to join them in their homes on their mountain. Who wants to share their home with problematic peoples who don't follow their ways? We know the Vikings had the technology and knowledge of how to build ships. Perhaps the conflicting ideas and beliefs of all these people is what caused the destruction of the heavens. Okay, so if the symbolic role of sun and moon were being played by an honored brother and sister, who was the Sunna being chased by the wolves in the Christian book of Revelation? The woman was said to be clothed in the sun. In the Gordian tumulus that housed the Ark replica, they found yellow ochre. It stands to reason that they could dye their clothing, but it wouldn't have shone like the sun. Ancient Lydians wore clothing of wool, linen, and silk. Silk shone. Lydian culture occupied much of the western region of Turkey in the Iron Age. It stands to reason they'd have access to silk and yellow ochre. Their capital was in the lowlands around Sardis on the very southwest edge of Turkey, on the Mediterranean. In Greek mythology, Omphale, a queen of Lydia, was not recognized as being a goddess. She was a mistress of Heracles, where he was forced into servitude for a year and granted sex in return. Her father, Yardanus, was said to be a river god, who bought Heracles as a slave for her. This sounds like we had a Valkyrie induction into the heavens. They were still following the Sun-Moon tribe traditions here. Her previous husband, Tmolus, was gored to death by a bull. This was punishment for attacking one of Artemis's nymphs, Archehippe. This absolutely sounds like a punishment they would have inflicted on them for attacking Valkyrie women. Now, is Archehippe our women dressed in the sun? Did the cult maintain control over the region? The Lydians were named after their king Lydas, son of Attis. Attis was the male fertility god linked to Cybele of Pessinus. Some say Attis was Tantalus, a son of Zeus, or a thunder god, or Tmolus himself. Was the nymph's pursuer a descendant of Thor, or the inheritor of his god role? Some folks believe that Nanna's father was Mani. Perhaps this was symbology meant to discredit the reign of these women goddesses and spread a new religion, one that would be ruled over by men instead of women. The Lydians defeated the Phrygians between 700 and 600 BC. They appear to state that the cult's followers won the war and continued to rule over the region. The Lydian civilization ended between 600 and 500 BC. Athena's cult persisted up until 400 BC in Greece, just before the time of Alexander the Great. He was to succeed his father Philip II of Macedonia, but there were some threats to his reign, and he started removing relatives to secure the throne. This threw the region into war, and the surrounding peoples didn't like his behavior, but Alexander was successful in conquering most of the known world. He favored Persian or Iranian nobles, and many of them were in his armies, his government, and his satrapies as he conquered cities. After his death in 323 BC, the region divided into 8 different kingdoms. The largest kingdom was held by the Persians, now known as Persia. I believe this civilization's rulers decided to form Judaism as a patriarchal religion to displace the former female-based world religion. This new religion would favor the wealthy Persian and Iranian folks who wanted to remain an authority figure across the lands, many of which were not their lands. We can see much of its mythology borrows from religion and stories in the Mediterranean region. Many of them are based on the original female cult's stories. The goddess Inanna, or Ishtar's cult in Mesopotamia, lasted the longest around 600 CE. Now, the Iranians like to claim ownership to this cult, but we can see her temple was associated to a very specific region around Uruk in 4000 BC. This region of Sumeria flooded in 3500 BC. This would have caused Inanna's followers to abandon her because she wasn't going to protect them from floods. Many probably would have fled to the nearby Godin Tepe on higher ground. It is very likely that Noah was her faithful, and he left the region after building his ark. If Noah is Norder, it is very likely he told our Sun-Moon tribe about his lady's beliefs. They very likely incorporated them into their own mythology as a means of intimidating the now invading Hittite population who were fleeing the floods across Sumerian lands. These people were trying to invade the Sun-Moon tribe's lands at a higher elevation to take it for themselves. We know that Freya, the daughter of Njordr, became a Valkyrie. It is very likely that her descendants, followers of the Sun-Moon tribe, children of the faithful Noah, returned to Sumeria in 2334 BC to return Inanna and Ishtar to the region. Is there a correlation in ancient history that might make Ragnarok a real event that we can see and track? In Greek mythology, during the Trojan War, Phrygia was under attack by Amazons. Phrygia covered most of the region formerly under control by this Sun-Moon tribe. Perhaps the divided men and women of Asgard were fighting with each other, or the heavens were under siege. Many might be familiar with this story. Paris of Troy took Helen from her husband, Menelaus of Sparta. It sparked a huge war. She was the daughter of Zeus and Leto. So, she would have been a goddess. If she was a daughter of Thor, she would have been a Valkyrie, and the king could not claim ownership to her. she would have been allowed to mate with whomever she chose. The Amazons were fighting on the side of Troy, which would make sense. They'd say Helen had the choice of husband. By opposing her choice, Menelaus was upsetting the traditions of the gods in the region. So, does this make Helen our fleeing Valkyrie woman Saul, and Menelaus our tyrant king? Sparta's colors were crimson and gold. The woman wore gold, and the dragon boat was red. Menelaus was a descendant of Tantalus, and we already know this family was at odds with the women. Did the men wage war on the women to take control of the region? If this fleeing Valkyrie was Helen, then the baby's identity would have been Nicostrausus. But this son was said to be born after the Trojan War, after Helen was reclaimed. He had another illegitimate son called Megapenthes. They were both deemed to be sons of slaves. They claimed Megapenthes' mother was Pyrrhicis. Sounds like Paris, no? Maybe she fled with a woman to Troy instead of a man. Troy was believed to be northwest of Pessinus, located in Hisar Lake, Turkey. The Trojan War was in 12,000 BC. This was the time of the Late Bronze Age collapse, linked to environmental collapse and major migration in the region. The Greeks say Zeus believed there were too many people, so he manufactured a war to depopulate the earth, especially of his demigod descendants. They warred for 9 years, many cities were sacked, the army started revolting due to lack of supplies, so when the gods supplied food, many soldiers kept fighting. Many gods and heroes were slain in this war. One king from Ethiopia, Memnon, brought thousands of men of foreign armies with Persians, Indians, and Ethiopians in an attempt to defend Troy. When he fell, his foreign armies scattered, and only the Ethiopians remained. His mother was said to be Eos, a goddess of the dawn. His father was snatched away by her and taken to the ends of the Oceanus. He was raised by nymphs on the coast, so it's very likely he was a loyalist to the Valkyrie women and their practicing gods. The war ended when they resorted to trickery and brought out the famous Trojan horse and sacked Troy. The remaining Spartan allies took their war trophies, including women, and retreated back home. Many of them met their deaths on the way back. Now to the south in Egypt, this was during the reign of Ramses III. It was about the time of Moses. The kingdom was attacked by the Libyans and the Sea Peoples. Sea Peoples would have been anyone coming from the Mediterranean Sea to the north. Very likely, these were deserting soldiers or displaced settlers from 9 years of the Trojan War. The Sea Peoples were defeated. Ramses gathered them up and put them in southern Canaan, across the Red Sea, a region his father had conquered before making peace with the Hittites there. This seems to imply Moses' exodus was a story told from displaced, disgruntled Sea Peoples who were defeated by Egypt. These people followed the sun-moon cult ways to go to the temple to appeal to help from our winged maidens. They weren't gods, but they did believe in them. These people were likely deserters or settlers who never fought in the war. Now the wars took a great toll on the Egyptian treasury. Smoke from the burning settlements to the north blocked the sun and prevented plant growth. The workers' strikes began when the pharaoh couldn't feed all his workers. Unrest rose, he started adding fortifications to his temples, and he was eventually assassinated. Essentially, the Trojan War was a religious war that sparked World War Zero. Specifically, the Spartan king's actions defying the existing religious laws. Now, after the war, you'd have a huge amount of young men, many of them foreign, milling around the area with no food, no wives, no leaders, basically no purpose anymore. These men possibly turned around and headed home, or tried to find somewhere nearby to settle into a new home. The resources on the surrounding area very likely couldn't support this many people. Remember, they burned down all the cities and fields to the north where they were fighting. These were the resources they had previously depended on to feed them. Now, perhaps the gods were desperate to maintain their control over the region and didn't understand the consequences of bringing this many men into it. Maybe they thought they'd be doing the world a favor by trying to kill off the excess poor men they were gathering for the war. But it backfired. Many of the troops just deserted and started terrorizing the region. The poor folks weren't educated in resource management and maintaining the heavens, so the gods and the heavens were destroyed. These men only knew war. They were mercenaries. They wanted wealth, women, and food, and they consumed everything in the area and set themselves up as tyrant kings. Basically, community peace was lost. The remains of our moon tribe civilization was at its end. The gods, or what was left of them, left the region. So, where did they go? After the Trojan War, the Scythians were thought to be located around the Black Sea. The burial of the Amazons was found on the north side of the Black Sea within Russia. Perhaps while the Yotan men and former allies went south towards Egypt, the cult of women and the remaining male gods with them decided to go north, somewhere that wasn't ravaged by war. This is the direction we find Vikings and Norse mythology today. The Hindu goddess Kali is said to appear from the sleeping body of Vishnu, who in the creation myth was previously associated with the scaled fish. Her goal was to protect Brahma, her creator, from two demons. She wakes up Vishnu so he can defeat them. Kali is said to have blue skin. Now in Ragnarok, Hel rode a scaled ship, which could be considered a fish, to the heavens, to bring troops and aid her father and brothers in the war as allies to the Jotun. Her skin was said to be part blue, part flesh-colored. Her father, the one who created her, was Loki. A father could be considered a creator. Was her father Brahma? The story of Ragnarok does not say what happens to Hel. Perhaps while the Valkyrie were distracted with the war at Troy, she made her move to free her father and move against the gods. Vishnu is described as sleeping on the coils of the serpent Shesha. Loki is said to have a son, Jormungandr, a serpent that is thrown into the seas. Perhaps it was a ship or vessel and not actually a son. One description of Vishnu is that which frees from fetters and bondage. At the beginning of Ragnarok, Loki is freed from imprisonment to fight on the side of Jotun, but Heimdall was said to have killed him. Did he escape? Vali, son of Loki, was said to survive Ragnarok. Vali is a berserker, which means through ritual becomes an animal. The animal god in the Hindu pantheon is said to be Ganesh, child of Shiva and Parvati. Parvati is said to be the reincarnation of Sati, Shiva's first wife who immolated herself. She's the daughter of a mountain king and queen, said to be the sister of Vishnu. The Norse analogy for Sati would have been Nanna. She was the Valkyrie who immolated herself to descend with Balder. She was the symbol of the Valkyrie goddesses whose religion was spreading through the region. Kali had also been associated or linked to Parvati. It says Parvati merges with Shiva's body to form Kali to defeat Daruka, a demon that terrorized the forest. Perhaps this simply meant that Parvati is Angrboda, consort of Loki and mother of Hel, and Hel helped defeat one of the gods that was terrorizing their former home. Angrboda was light-skinned, though her daughter was dark blue, much like these gods. Parvati was also a goddess linked to wealth. Hel reigned over Gordian, which was said to have golden gates. They probably had wealth. Shiva is called the Destroyer. He lived an ascetic life in the mountains. Well, Loki was forced into prison, where he was tortured and made to think on his actions before being released at the beginning of the war. His family destroyed the heavens. This might be a more pleasant way of describing that experience. But Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu couldn't be the same person, could they? The Skanda Purana states Vishnu is no one but Shiva, and he is the one called Shiva, but is identical with Vishnu. Together the three of them form the Hindu Trimurti, or Trinity of Supreme Gods. Maybe they were all the same person, but playing different roles. Loki is known for dressing up in disguises and trying to trick folks. Perhaps it's possible that Hel gathered her father and surviving family when they lost control over their armies. Maybe they traveled with some of Memnon's Indian soldiers back home after the war and tried to become new gods there. Loki and his family definitely would not have been welcome with the rest of the Norse gods. In the Chinese myth of the Jade Emperor, he was born an ordinary man. He devoted his childhood to helping others, especially the needy, hungry, disabled, and abandoned. He retreated to a mountain cave and performed many trials. A powerful entity wanted to conquer the immortals and gods in heaven to proclaim sovereignty over the universe. It too retreated and performed trials. It re-entered the world and recruited an army. The Jade Emperor saw an evil glow in the sky. He challenged the evil entity. Mountains shook, and rivers and seas toppled. Its armies were scattered. In reward, the Jade Emperor was raised up to be the sovereign ruler of all. Perhaps the Jade Emperor was also someone who had been imprisoned, but he had learned from his mistakes. He did not want to side with the Jotun or with Loki's family, so he challenged them and was rewarded for that by leaving the area, taking his people with him. This myth comes from Taoist religion, which starts around 600 BC. It implies the Jade Emperor was an outsider, but not an enemy to the mountain gods, because he helped defeat the gathering invading armies. Perhaps one of the allied settlements is where he came from, such as the Vanir, dwarves, or elves. Maybe they retreated to Asia to rule there. The construction of the oracle at Delphi began in 800 BC. The structure of this city had some similar elements to the idea of Asgard, but appeared to have a Norse Norn presiding over the city, instead of fertility goddesses. Perhaps a new form of the cult arose out of the ashes of the old ways. In Northern Europe, shield maidens as female warriors still featured prominently in Norse mythology, and burials of women with weapons have been found across Europe. But even there, we can see the women's role in society has been diminished. In an era of oppression towards women that came out of the Middle East following the birth of Christ, the Vikings still granted women more rights than other cultures. They were allowed to have a say in who they would marry and if they wanted a divorce. They could own land and reclaim dowries if their marriages failed. If their man died, they carried on the family business role or trade. Perhaps this was in respect to the women that kept them alive during apocalyptic times. In Christian religion, you're supposed to give up wealth to the less fortunate, and churches were gathering it. They displayed their wealth openly to impress folks. They sent hordes of treasures back to Rome to their leadership. The Vikings were attacking settlements with these churches and their convoys. We see burials of Viking treasures all over Europe. The gold is buried at the bottom, with the silver on top. Sometimes there are gemstones. It appears as if they took the copper, bronze, and iron that could be converted into weapons and tools, but didn't have any use for the silver or gold. Vikings extracted metals from peat bogs. They didn't mine them. Perhaps they refused to mine for metals because in the ancient lands, the folks who had metals went power mad first. Perhaps this is an indication that their culture associated metals with wealth, and wealth with evil, greed, corruption, and wars. Maybe these folks saw themselves as freedom fighters. By burying the gold and silver, they were returning evil cursed wealth to the earth to appease the angry gods, who would then protect them at sea or from the harsher climates they lived in. Some historians believe common Viking men were seeking out wealth or women from foreign lands because the women in their own lands only wanted wealthier men, that they needed this treasure to attract women. Ah, the birth of the gold-digging myth. Let's remember it was the reverse in ancient history. You gained wealth and status after being favored by the women for following God's rules. Don't you think if they wanted the treasure to attract women, they would have kept the treasure instead of burying it? In the Annals of Ulster in 1821, the Vikings plundered an Irish village and took their women away. What happened to those women? Perhaps these warrior men came alone, intending to stay in the lands, and needed the women to create their own settlements. These men were not favored by the Norse women. Maybe they were just the latest versions of rejected folks cast out of the heavens in a never-ending cycle. Why is it always the men fighting, gathering wealth, causing wars, committing crimes, wandering around the world, causing chaos, and being rejected for it? In summary, I believe that most people think of the gods as beings that lived somewhere high up in the stars or the heavens. Many stories refer to them as being on or from the moon. If we look at the planetary body that orbits our planet, it does appear as if it suffered an apocalyptic supervolcanic event that might have destroyed their civilization. Perhaps it had its own version of Ragnarok that ended the first world and began the second, the fall of Ymir, possibly a meteor, down to Earth. In some versions of Chinese creation stories about Pangu, he was aided by 4 holy beasts: turtle, phoenix, qilin, and dragon. The phoenix is associated with the thunderbird or pterodactyl. We see symbols of it in South America. The turtle was associated with the Ojibwe myth in North America. The qilin is a sort of lizard unicorn horse. Perhaps it was a precursor to the horses that was associated with the Valkyrie men and women's chariots. The dragon in Chinese myth looks like a long sea serpent. Perhaps this symbol was meant to be associated with the forces of Loki. The Navajo sky god Asanotli, who created heaven, earth, and the sky, described 4 cardinal points, symbolized by a color: white in the east, blue in the south, yellow in the west, and black in the north. If you completely turn the Earth's axes, north points to Africa, west to Asia, east to Europe, and south to Mongolia or Russia. Most of the native peoples across North and South America were said to descend from Mongolians. Perhaps it was blue because it was a colder temperature out that way. Does this describe the migration path of the original survivors of the Great Flood? Perhaps the originator of these stories learned of the 4 major tribes surviving after those floods and tried to describe how they moved apart from one another. This speaks to a higher power that visited all of these peoples at a time before planes, the internet, and fast sea travel. Before everyone starts thinking E.T., there is one myth of red-haired giants who were wiped out by a tribe of northern Paiutes in Nevada. The cave remains were discovered in 1912. They found mummified human remains and artifacts. The Paiutes believed these people were cannibals and killed them. According to their history, the peoples living around them called them Saidokara, which meant conquerors or enemies. This implies perhaps these red-haired giants were friends of these other peoples. Did these red-haired giants travel great distances across the seas to spread this myth after the Trojan War? There are also rumors of Egyptian-like ruins hiding deep in the mountains of Arizona, though no one seems to be able to pinpoint their location. All records keep getting wiped out. Did another group of folks make it out this way? Overall, there are many stories of great spirits or sky gods warning cultures about the impending floods and trying to send peoples to salvations on higher lands. But many of the actual stories of gods in the heavens are coming from earthly mythologies linked to peoples living in the mountains of western Turkey, and the Sun-Moon tribe that was supposedly living there. Perhaps the great spirits were sending folks to this tribe intentionally. Perhaps these were the great spirits themselves. The idea of cycles and rebirth is found as well. The Hopi, a Native American tribe, believes that we live in the 4th world. The Tawa, a sun spirit, created the first world out of endless space, as well as its inhabitants. Tawa first created Sotuknang, who he called his nephew. He was sent to create the 9 universes. The Spider-Woman was created as a messenger of God and acted as a go-between deity and the people. Like our Valkyries, she creates life under the direction of Sotuknang. Masawu, or Skeleton Man, was a master of the 4th world. He was there when the door was opened to the 3rd and would open the door to the 5th. He is described as being a handsome, bejeweled man wearing a hideous mask. Supposedly, he leads them to new lands. Some say that a great flood ended the third world and that the Spider Woman taught them to make boats, that they landed on a mountainous coast in the fourth world. They too were given sacred border tablets like is seen in Egypt, which outline their territory. They believe that they were direct descendants of the Pleiades, a constellation, which were also known in some myths as 7 sisters. They believed that when they died, their spirit would return south to that constellation. The Valkyrie in the Christian myth had a crown with 12 stars, and the Valkyries were said to have 9 sisters, the daughters of Aegeus, named after waves. It's interesting that peoples far apart, geographically speaking, would have very similar societies and beliefs. The tribe of the Sun and Moon in Turkey first appeared at the end of the Ice Age. The earliest settlement in this region was Göbekli Tepe and was thought to be inhabited in 9500 BC. The gods that settled to the west of there lived in milder plains next to a volcano which produced food for the region. Their cult appeared to remain in power across most of the Middle East, the Mediterranean Sea, and northern Africa until the time of the Trojan War in 12,000 BC. People started fighting over who was more important, men or women. At this point in time, the gods' power started diminishing. By 400 BC, it was removed from Greece. The tribe's descendants moved to northern Europe and continued as the Norse mythology and Viking culture. After Alexander the Great started conquering the known worlds, the remaining region followed suit. In the Middle East, the cult was finally wiped out by 600 CE. These women appeared to approach migration as we do in today's society. They had a haven and created a place where they could provide the resources needed to sustain life. They had laws, punished crimes, and raised up people who supported the communities. They adopted outsiders who needed their help. These women saw many of the same problems we associate with migration today. Many countries, when they have excess, try to admit folks who might help them, and they reject folks who cause problems. Many newcomers don't respect the laws, and wars are fought over resources and how to run the communities. We see racism, familiar preferencing, hoarding of wealth, and crimes committed by newcomers, who think this is acceptable because that's how they survived before coming here. In today's society, we are ruled by fallible, greedy people, acting in their own best interests instead of the good of the community, and perhaps this is why the world is continuously being pushed to the brink of war, resource exhaustion, and global warming. We can see through mythological stories that the women's role as ruler was replaced by men. These men brought more of their own by amassing armies or breeding children they didn't want to support. The resulting civilizations had populations that grew out of control, and resulting migration destroyed the very environments they lived in the endless male quest for wealth and power. Is this not the same problem we see today? These women were multicultural. They did not require marriages. They did not hold a concept of racism and would admit members from many races. They produced children with men who were seen to be wise, strong, or had value to their communities only when they had need to replace a role that already existed within it. They did not create excess children or raise armies that were impossible to support. They trained apprentices to carry on pivotal community duties. They supported LGBTQ communities. They deftly managed their resources and shared with outsiders when they had excess. They fought to uphold laws and punished those who hurt women, stole resources, murdered folks, or failed to uphold their contracts or oaths. They lived in balance with the nature and environment around them to maintain a heaven-like environment for many generations. Our society could learn a lot from these women. I'm sad that we didn't get to see the world that might have been if they were left in charge. Would we have all been living in the heavens? Thank you for listening to today's Musings of Rin. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Until next time.